Hello, YouTube, coming to you live from twitch.tv/Tettles. Today we are going to be talking about why some classes are, I think the word I want to use is like predisposed, more predisposed to being a meta Mythic Plus spec and a meta Mythic Plus choice over seasons than others. I get asked this question a lot, like what class should I reroll to? What class should I play in dungeons and that kind of thing. And while there is no true answer, there definitely is an emerging trend where some classes are definitely more likely than not to be brought to dungeons season over season. And these classes are like, obviously they're like rogue, monk, druid, like whether it's healing or balance, I think is also one of the ones that's has a higher chance of being like really good. And then I think Blood DK would also probably fall in that category. We haven't had a Blood DK season in a while because they've been like criminally undertuned. But we'll talk about like what makes even something like Blood DK, if they are tuned close, then they're likely to be almost oppressively strong. And so we're going to talk about what makes classes like have a higher chance of being more predisposed to being and falling into the meta. So before we talk about just like what problems exist in high keys from season to season, what I really think about is what is the reason that some classes have a higher representation season in and season out. We're going to talk about, like, first off, it's really important to note that this stuff is not super relevant for even timing 15s. Like, obviously, every spec can do a 15, but it's not something that's mandatory for even doing a 15. Basically, every spec and every class can absolutely do a 15. However, I will say that this is something that's going to be relevant for high key pushing groups, which ultimately end up shaping the meta even at like a 15 level. Like, I'm sure you guys, and we can even look at it right here. So whenever we look at all Mythic plus Keystone levels for the timed runs this season, you see actually a pretty even spread. Like, obviously there's some outliers. Like, there are a lot of MM hunters. I would say 6% like MM hunters, 6% Moonkins. That's pretty high compared to normal. Whenever you actually start to get to like the 15s, you actually really start to see some specs and some classes starting to just bleed out the rest of them. You see a lot of hunters, you see a lot of resto shamans, you see a lot of fire mages, a lot of moonkins, a lot of vengeance demon hunters, right? So you really do start to see like some ultimate trends end up emerging. And while it's not super relevant, it is something that you definitely do have to factor in whenever you're deciding whether or not you should like reroll, whether or not you should continue to play a class and whatnot. And so I'm not saying that you need to reroll your spec or reroll your class that you've been on for forever, but it's definitely something that you have to factor in as well, is that even at the 15 level, people are definitely more inclined to take some stuff that's a little bit more meta. I also want to say that very quickly that this isn't always super relevant for MDI, as the MDI meta and live key meta differ pretty heavily from time to time. That's due to the things that matter in the MDI most are the things that increase your speed in the dungeon, whereas a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today is like utility-based and survivability-based, which doesn't always translate super well to speed. We can talk about like damage profiles as well. That's something that I do want to bring up. But damage profiles, utility, it's all a package. And some things are more important for MDI than live keys. This isn't going to be like made for the MDI, although there is similar logical conclusions that you can make about the MDI if you match them up together, but you're going to be looking for a different end result than if you were pushing high keys on live. So that leads you to my hypothesis, which is basically some classes have an easier time becoming meta in Mythic Plus. And that's due to the fact that there are only 5 slots in dungeons, and things such as like mob control are going to be the most important metric by a lot. Obviously, there's like a minimum floor of DPS that you have to have in a dungeon, but infrequently do I feel like there are some seasons where we definitely have hit like damage is the most important metric, but more often than not, the most important metric is being able to survive the whole entire dungeon, do the pulls how you would otherwise like have them set up, like make sure that they're set up correctly is like a really important thing, and like just are the mobs like CC'd in any correct manner? Are they stacked for prolonged periods of time? Are you able to really get your burst out? Like making sure that the pull goes clean is the biggest deal, and then things such as I don't know, like immunities and whatnot are important, but less important, if that makes any sense. So mob control is definitely going to be the most important metric just as the whole in dungeons. And since there are only 5 slots, you can only really have a couple of I would describe them as like burden specs that don't bring a lot to the success of the dungeon. So there are a couple of qualifying metrics that end up making some specs a little bit more desirable than others. And I think the first one, we'll talk about damage. Again, like I said, I don't think damage is actually the most important thing, but it's definitely something that you have to factor in. How specs do their damage, or potentially even healing, makes specs and classes have a higher predisposition to being meta. You see this a lot, I feel like, with healing. Resto Druid, more often than not, has a higher chance of becoming the meta healer, and it's because of how they do their healing. So, like, they heal up via healing over time effects, and that allows them more often than not to be able to do a decent amount of damage while keeping the group relatively healthy. And that's obviously very, very powerful for dungeons. Holy Paladin, also another really dominant healer from time to time, just because the fact that they do a lot of their damage passively, right? Like Crusader Strike, and just the fact that they do have to do damage to also do healing, that also makes them, more often than not, pretty good. And on the alternative, there are some specs or classes that just don't end up doing the best amount of healing, or stuff like Restoration Shaman. They don't have like a tank defensive. That's like a big deal. Like the fact that they don't have a tank defensive is like a pretty big deal in dungeons, because a lot of the stresses on the party are definitely going to be like in the result of tank damage, and like how big can the tank fundamentally pull before he has to start tapering it back. And so having a tank defensive is normally like pretty large thing that keeps Restoration Shaman more often than not like not in a great state, or harder to bring, rather, is what I want to say. So as for DPS, like obviously that was healing, and in DPS we actually see it in the form of AoE caps, this expansion, where some classes are target capped. And so if you're going to bring one of these target cap specializations, like Windwalker, Monk, or MM Hunter, they better be the absolute best at 5 targets. Like, they better be just beating that ass at 5 targets of every other spec in the game, and it shouldn't be close. Or they end up being like, oh, if they're doing a normal amount of damage at 5 targets, what happens whenever you pull 10? They're just doing no damage. Like, they're literally doing not the same damage as some of the stuff that's uncapped, such as Fire Mage, such as Moonkin. This leads into potential for stuff like Affliction Lock to become better, but we haven't seen that yet. But the AoE cap is definitely something that you have to factor in whenever you see how specs do their damage or healing. It's not always the most important thing, but the amount of damage that a class provides, if a spec or a class is doing an overwhelming amount of damage, like I have this titled, does a spec do 20% more damage than other specializations at Fire Mage, then it can force itself into the meta. And that's what you see from time to time, where some specs will just push themselves so far above other specs that they will force themselves in the meta just based on how much DPS they're doing. So with damage profiles covered, the most important thing is definitely going to be the utility of dungeons, and this is what makes some specs more desirable season in and season out. And there is different types of utility, and the most important type of utility is like this S tier utility. I've described it as polarizing utility, and it's utility that makes the dungeons fundamentally easier to do, or like utility that you will route around. And these are things such as trees, binding shot, ring of peace, silent sigil, mass grip, shroud, like that kind of stuff that you're actively, whenever you are designing a route or designing a pull, you were designing it with these utility abilities in mind, because they make the pulls either so much easier, or they make the pulls even doable, or they change like the count that you're going to have happening. Like, and that's like Shroud. That's what Shroud does, is like it can change where you're going to be getting count from. And that's actually a pretty big deal from time to time. Obviously, invisibility potions are a thing too, but from time to time, invisibility potions aren't always that great. The opportunity cost, like that kind of thing. Shroud, pretty universally good though. Then, right below the what I qualified as the S tier utility, it's utility that makes dungeons slightly easier. And that's stuff like Sigil of Chains. I think that's just like a worse version of Mass Grip, but it's still stuff that makes the dungeons a lot easier. Ursul's Vortex. I mean, again, keeping the mob stacked, pretty big deal. Tricks of the Trade, misdirection, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's good, but it's not going to change your routing. And then it's just like Bloodlust versus Drums, native battle res versus like engineering battle res. That stuff is good, but if you were lacking it, it's not like the end of the world in some seasons, right? Like, obviously, like, some of this other utility is not the end of the world if you're lacking it in some seasons, but like, if you have it, it makes your dungeon noticeably easier for the tank, for the DPS, keeping mobs stacked up, that kind of stuff. And so yeah, there's some utility that just makes dungeons slightly easier, and that ends up being like stuff like sigil chains, vortex tricks, that kind of stuff. And I didn't list everything, right? I'm obviously talking about stuff that's a little bit more in the forefront of the meta right now, but you get the point, right? And there's some stuff that may end up being S tier utility that I forgot about. There's some stuff that may end up being like utility that makes dungeons slightly easier that I forgot about. But then the third metric is like the rest of the utility, and that's AoE stuns. That's like normal stops, like blind and gouge and shit. The melee interrupts, I would say, is also just like rest of the utility. Because melee interrupts are good, but they're not, especially not this expansion, they're not mandatory. They were last expansion, though. Having a lot of melee interrupts was like a really big deal last expansion. Being ranged, also, I would classify that as rest of the utility. Being ranged is like really good this expansion. Not having to stand in melee is a pretty big deal. And there's shit like Wind Shear on your healer. There are Soothes for enraged dispels. There's Mass Dispel, which is like situationally pretty good. There are immunities. There are cheat deaths. There's natural tankiness of like specs. And those things I would say is like rest of the utility, right? And so the rest of the utility is good. But if you had, I don't know, the tankiest person with, you have to have like a lot of this rest of the utility to bump your spec natively higher than some of the stuff that brings this polarizing utility, right? You have to have an inordinate amount of like this just other utility to be able to bump yourself higher. And so I want to make a chart talking about where I end up ranking, not like ranking, but just show you and talk through like where you would end up placing things such as like Fire Mage, MM Hunter, Balanced Druid Rogue, and then some of the stuff like where you would end up putting some of the stuff that's like high DPS below utility, and talk about why some of that stuff and some classes bring an amount of utility that is just so valuable that they end up becoming meta. And I think that that's important to talk about why that happens as well. Fuck yeah, I don't know what was wrong. We'll use this color for Mage. Anyways, okay, so ellipses. So we got your Mage, and as I said, they bring some things, right? There's some things that they bring that are good. They bring like Dragon's Breath. They bring Ring of Frost. I think that's all good. They bring an immunity. Of course, they're like relatively unkillable, right? They bring like Sheep. They do bring some good stuff. Most of the shit that they bring is not that useful, though. I would say that most of the utility that Mage brings is not the most useful thing to dungeons. However, Mage does bring one thing that's like super important, and it's their damage profile. And in the state that the game is currently in with uncapped AoE versus capped AoE, Mage brings some of the best uncapped AoE by a lot, and somehow like their damage is overwhelmingly better than every other spec. Again, I don't know how Mage got to this point, but again, their damage is overwhelmingly better than every other spec. Let's say Mage goes here. They're at the top of the DPS. They're somewhere in the middle for utility. I would say a little bit less than middle for utility. They're okay. Yeah, I would say that they're okay. Their utility is like pretty decent, but they're not the absolute pinnacle of everything, right? Then you have shit like Rogue. Let's find a yellow. Rogue, their damage is honestly pretty meh. Rogue's damage is honestly not that great. It's competitive, I would say, but it's not competitive with like Fire Mage. It's competitive with like normal specs, and it may even be slightly below average. And honestly, Rogue damage may be slightly below average, but their utility that they bring to the group is above, like significantly above average, to the point where even though if their DPS is slightly lackluster, the utility that they bring is just like unmatched. And that utility is in the form of stuff like tricks, in the form of stuff like out of combat CC. Sap is actually really, really useful in a lot of situations. They obviously have the most stops in the game, and it's not close. They have a melee kick, and then they also bring Shroud, which opens up your routing by, I would say it opens up your routing a lot. And then on top of that, more often than not, they're unkillable, right? So their utility is the absolute top, even if their damage is a little bit lower. I would say that's also the case for some other specs, such as like Balanced Druid and even like Windwalker Monk. I feel like those are the specs that ends up happening to a lot as well, where it's like Balanced Druid ends up being like pretty fucking stupid too, because they bring a lot of utility as well. They have like native battle. I mean, so I think that Balance and like Rogue are about the same point damage wise, but they like their utility is about the same as well. And it goes back to that, like, what is that S tier utility? Yeah, like trees, binding shot, ring of peace, silent sigil, mass grip shroud, right? And it's like trees are absolutely fucking OP. Solar beam, it can be good. It can also be like really bad, right? They have a lot of displacement abilities. There's a lot of fucking mob control that comes in from Balanced Druid. And so what do Balanced Druid and Rogue have a lot in common with? They have a lot of mob control. Both of them have just the most mob control, which, you know what it does? It makes your tank's job a lot easier. And that's like the most important thing, is that with a lot of the stuff, it makes the tank's job just infinitely easier to be able to manage pulls, be able to like keep the pack stacked up. That's like a pretty big deal for just overall group damage, because even though some specs may do more DPS, if you can do things to keep the pack stacked up closer, or you get more kicks, you get more stops, and the pack is like closer clumped up, then your group damage is going to go up. And so that's one of the things that Balanced Druid provides as well. That's another thing that Windwalker Monk brings. Windwalker Monk also another one of these specs that I feel like is just like has a higher predisposition to being just really, really, really good. And I don't think Windwalker Monk's utility is on the same level as like Rogue and Druid, but I do think it's close. And so typically, there's like a curve. And so you have Windwalker Monk. And so typically whenever Windwalker Monk is about in this state right here, where its DPS is close to the top, it doesn't have to necessarily be at the top, but if it's close to the top, like upper 75th percentile, upper 80th percentile, something like that, then Windwalker Monk is always seen in spades, right? And it's like the same as Hunter. I feel like Windwalker Monk and Hunter end up kind of filling the same niche a lot of the seasons, where it's like their utility really, really good, and you kind of just like, which one is better damage between the two, typically. And it's due to the fact that their utility really, really good. And shit like Binding Shot from Hunter is absolutely OP. Obviously, Misdirection really good as well. Feign Death can be good. Turtle, that kind of stuff from Hunter is super important. Whereas things like Ring of Peace, this is the best displacement ability in the game. You may think Ursul's Vortex may be better, and honestly, that could be a little bit contentious. I think Ring of Peace is above and beyond one of the best displacement abilities, because you can use it as a displacement to knock abilities. You can do it to knock casts. You can use it to keep mobs grouped up, and notably, it bounces them over and over and over again, and you can control patrols. And that allows you to start packs earlier and actually get like into the pull a little bit quicker, right? And so I think Ring of Peace is really important. They obviously also have an AoE stun, which should not ever be overlooked. Paralysis, Freezing Trap, that kind of stuff is also good, but it's not like bad. It's not always that great. But more to the point, the reason that I made this is to prove to like, so there are some specs and classes that have a higher predisposition to being meta, and it's typically going to be the classes that stray to this upper 80th percentile of utility, is where I would say where that stuff ends up landing, right? And so then you have things like, God, what is like the worst dungeon utility class? And probably like Enhancement Shaman. No, Enhancement can be okay. It's like it's either like Enhancement or like Fury Warrior, something like that. I think Warlock is even better. I somehow think Warlock is better than Enhancement and Fury Warrior, because they're both fucking melee. The biggest thing. We'll use Fury Warrior as an example. Damage isn't even the most important metric. So let's use Fury Warriors as an example. So Fury Warriors actually do pretty good damage. And so we'll put Fury Warrior here, right? And so Fury Warrior actually does pretty decent damage as a whole in dungeons. However, their utility is probably some of the worst, right? They do have they have like an AoE Fear. They have Intimidating Shout, right? They can also spec into Stormbolt. But like by and large, Fury Warrior doesn't really have any polarizing utility. Like all the utility that they have is this utility that's like I classified as like rest of the utility. It's all of that, just like they're pretty tanky, honestly. Fury Warrior is relatively tanky, but beyond that, like they don't have a lot that's going for them that's going to change how you fundamentally do the dungeon. And it's like, why would I bring a Fury Warrior that doesn't do a lot unless their damage is like here, right? If their damage is here, then it's a different story. But say their damage is not the absolute, like, if their damage is not route altering in some form or fashion, then why would you bring them? On top of that, they're also target capped. And that's also another thing that Fire Mage has going for it, is that it's not target capped. And sure, they do have Rallying Cry. And sure, they do have Battle Shout. Like, those are things that are nice. But, like, are you ever really going to fucking pull around Rallying Cry or Battle Shout in a dungeon? No. And it's not... It's just like one of those things that it's not going to ever be something that is the most important in the dungeon. Very important in raid. Rallying Cry and Battle Shout, absolutely astronomically important in raid. But whenever you only have 3 DPS slots, stuff like that's just like way less useful. And that's why you do see some things like Hunter, Windwalker Monk, Balanced Druid, and Rogue, which have a higher chance of just becoming meta because they have the utility in their kit first and foremost. And then if their damage is equitable to on par with other classes, then they start to excel and you start to see them being brought more and more. And it's because they do these things to your whole entire party that help you have success in the dungeon. So ultimately, some classes bring utility and sometimes an overwhelming amount of damage, but that's neither here nor there. That becomes so valuable that they become meta, meaning that some specs have a higher chance of becoming meta. I would say that most classes bring enough damage, but if they lack any polarizing utility, why would you bring them? Such as stuff like Fury Warrior or like DPS Death Knight. I mean, DPS DK even brings like good stuff, but like, why would you bring it? And Warlock brings a lot of good stuff, like Shadow Fury is great, Gate is great in some situations, but none of it's like really polarizing utility. So you get locked into these slots of like, why would you really bring these things, especially if they're not doing the absolute fucking most damage, or they don't have the best utility. And so the best utility, I feel like, is definitely something that is consistently going to make some specs in some classes better season in and season out. And I feel like you've seen that a lot with Rogue, and I feel like you've seen that a lot with Balancer. That it's like almost always meta, and Windwalker Monk too. And it's funny because I feel like we end up seeing Windwalker Monk so often as well, and even when their damage is not that great. Like season 2 of BFA, their damage was good, but it wasn't the best. But you still saw them a lot, and like that just shows you how much Windwalker Monk does end up bringing to keys. All right, so that leads me to want to talk about like what problems exist in high keys from season to season. I feel like I've hit this a little bit, but I didn't exactly hit it head on. And basically, the problems that exist in high keys from season to season are always like fairly consistent. It's things like tank damage is normally the most important metric, right? Like your healers can't really heal the tanks through 30 mobs. The tank survivability and like the act of them actually getting the mobs grouped up, and like the tank is going to be the linchpin a lot of the times in whether or not pulls are successful or not. Alternatively, it could just be kicks, but more often than not, I feel like it's just tank damage. And so things that help tanks with tank damage is going to be a big deal. Alternatively, you can just kite packs and things that keeps mobs grouped up more often than not, or reduce the amount of tank damage, are always going to be the most important things, because that's going to be able to turn a pull that you're able to do. Okay, so if you're able to do 2 packs at once, but you know that that third pack is doable if the tank could just like live the grouping of the pack itself, right? If you bring some of this S tier utility, such as like the Binding Shot, the trees, the Ring of Peace, right? And that is able to actively get the pack grouped up in a way that you would otherwise not be able to do that, you're turning 2 pulls straight up into 1. And so that ends up you're doing things like reducing pull duration, you're increasing your tank survivability, you're also increasing the amount of time that the tank is actively in the pack, you're lowering the duration of the pack being alive because the mobs are grouped up more frequently. That kind of thing is going to always be the most important utility, because if the mobs are grouped up, if the pack is not going to be spread, if the tank is able to pull bigger more frequently, then you're going to be able to go faster in the dungeon and do keys at a higher level than you would otherwise be able to do. And so those are the problems that exist from season to season. And that's normally the most important thing, is just like, it's not just tank survivability, but it's things that help assist your tank. And that kind of thing is always going to be just some of the most important stuff. And then obviously there are some other situational issues where it's like bosses need a stupid amount of healing. Galvast is like an example of the past where it's like that boss is really, really hard. You need a lot of healing for that. But in general, the problems are going to lie on your tank's ability to be able to get the mobs pulled in a reasonable manner and survive the pack, right? And it's, if they were only pulling one pack at a time, I don't think that this would ever be an issue. It would just take the stuff that has the highest DPS. And but with stuff, I don't know, it's not ever going to be like that because there's always an arms race with how big you can pull, how many mobs you can pull. Are you able to go faster? How fast can you go doing the highest key? And so that's why these problems exist from season to season, and that's why you see an emerging trend with some of the meta specs and meta classes. All right, so something I want to talk about too is what they could do to classes that have worse predispositions. I mean, obviously, these are things like they could add like some great utility to them, but I don't know like how much Blizzard truly can do without just like completely knocking down some of the utility that makes some of the best specs the best. And Blizzard does a notoriously terrible job of balancing utility between DPS, right? The classes with the best utility sometimes also just do the best DPS. And then you have seasons where people are playing triple outlaw rogue because they have the best utility and they do the best DPS. And Blizzard doesn't balance around it. And so Blizzard could do a lot of things. Like they could give every class something that's mega unique utility, like they're doing for Raid. They're actively doing this in Raid, which is weird because they're giving basically everybody like not a class buff, but they're giving, I don't know, there are 8 classes with almost mandatory utility that you have to bring in Raid, and they could do that for dungeons, but I don't actually know how they would be able to balance that in a 5-man situation. So I'm not even sure if it is balanceable. And so I did want to talk about that a little bit, but where I land on this is I don't think it actually is something that they can achieve without major overhauls to how they design classes. And I think that it would be one of the things where they have to either strip away good utility, which would be weird, and make everything really fucking bland, or they could add new utility to basically every single class to where every single class has something that's like mega unique. Those are some things that they could do, but it really is really hard to be able to balance. But at the same time, you're going to see some stuff be meta more often than not, such as like Resto Druid, Blood DK, Balance Druid, Hunter, Windwalker Monk, that kind of stuff. All that stuff has a higher chance of being meta than normal stuff more often than not. I know we haven't had a Blood DK season in a hot minute, but Mass Grip and like it's so weird to me that we haven't had a Blood DK season in a while, because Mass Grip and the ability to be able to self-sustain is like the most important metrics for tanking. Like those are some of the things that should be the real best for tanking, is if they're able to keep themselves alive without much healing. And Mass Grip is just fucking OP utility, but we haven't had a Blood DK in a hot minute. But we'll see. They're definitely, they have a higher chance of being good, but their effective health is just so bad right now. But yeah, that's gonna be the end of the video. I hope you guys all enjoyed the video. I feel like this ended up being a little bit ranty, and I hope that once I'm editing this, it doesn't feel like I'm rambling on, but I may end up to have just rambled for an hour. But we'll see how the editing ends up shaping up. But in the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day and enjoy the video, and I will see you guys in the next one.